Okay, hello, welcome back. Thank you for joining me again. I've been thinking hard about this whole series, Goodbye Psychopaths, and I think it's coming to an end in that my focus is going to be much more on the positive, on once we have identified this as a major issue for ourselves, or the health, our personal health, and the health of humanity, and indeed the planet, then we should move on to more positive vibes. I'm thinking of a title like Welcome Home Humanity. And so that is what we're going to be doing from now on. But before we leave the whole concept of Goodbye Psychopaths and slightly switch the focus into welcoming, as we say goodbye to the psychopaths, we want to welcome in humanity. It's important to talk about the reason I'm doing this, which is something that I've noticed for many years, and only relatively recently has a name being given to the problems that I'm seeing. And that name is called complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, even that term isn't ideal as far as I'm concerned, because from the outset I will say that this is not a label to somehow distance those people who have this condition from the rest of us, because I tell you why. Because we've all got it. We've all got it to a certain extent. One of the reasons that I've done this series and certain other things like my music in my life is to heal and not be a victim to complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Even though I experienced all the signs, I was determined that this was not going to convert into me, into my body, and make me physically sick. The anxiety wasn't going to kill me. So I'm under no illusions that complex post-traumatic stress disorder is a lethal condition. And there are those who are the most vile and perpetrators of this, who it would appear not only don't care about this, but actually relish in this. However, the vast majority of people involved in perpetrating this, or being allies, flying monkeys, assistants, are in a state of cognitive dissonance, and as the penny drops, they become willfully blind because of their own egos. If this isn't the most important aspect of health, it is very high up. In the last 40 years where I've been practicing medicine, I've seen a huge shift away from the communicable diseases being the most serious conditions that we can have, the TBs, although we've got syphilis still coming back, and of course we've had the AIDS epidemic. But what we're seeing is the epidemic of anxiety disorders, depression, autoimmune conditions, overload conditions, conditions that are basically due to our bodies not being able to cope with the complexity and fear that's we've been subjected to. And for more than 20 years I've been following this sort of diagram. I've been explaining this to the people that come to see me, and I have to say it is relevant to most. And I'll explain it briefly because it explains this complex post-traumatic stress syndrome, which is many, many traumas that we have been impacted by since our birth, but also what we have taken on from previous generations, particularly people who have fought wars and being repressed, whether they're men or women. The evidence is strong that we come into this world with this burden, if you like, or something to be healed, to be more positive about it. But of course that impacts on our parents and the society around us. It impacts on how we are brought up. It impacts on the discipline that we're given. It impacts on whether parents are addicted to alcohol, drugs, smoking. Smoking, after all, is a suppressant of anxiety and was promoted in wartime situations to do that, to suppress anxiety and ultimately grief, which we feel here, of course. It's interesting that as the Western world, if you like, is more likely to come off the effects of smoking, we're seeing grief being more readily accepted. We can see that 20 years ago at the funeral of Princess Di, where there was grief about Princess Di, but there was also a lot of pent-up grief about so many other things. So there's an expression of that. And I think even the move to cannabis, for instance, is also there mainly because we still hold all these anxieties within us. Anxiety disorders now are my main focus in my work in student health, far more than coughs and colds, which, as you know, we can do very little about. Anxiety, of course, is important for us. If we are confronted by a grizzly bear, for instance, it is important for us to feel a little bit anxious and to work out how to get the hell out of it. The same if we're crossing the road. We can't just go in. We have to be anxious about such activities. However, the problem with anxiety disorders is that the body has been conditioned into a state of being anxious the majority of time, the large amount of time that we spend here in the day and at night where we can't sleep. And the problem about this is that the person suffering an anxiety disorder or having panic attacks can't identify what it is that's doing it. Sure, there can be triggers, and in fact there will be little triggers, but there's this great mass of our past that's been conditioned to fear that lies beneath the surface. And it is totally crazy that the first call being a doctor, that we're supposed to be able to analyse and understand this in 10 minutes or a quarter of an hour. It's totally crazy and actually very dangerous. In fact, we can probably only do it in that time if we are ourselves in a state of denial about our own anxieties and fears. Hence, the first step is understanding this and becoming aware of this with the view to dispelling it, to welcoming back humanity, welcoming back true humanity into us, into our souls, dare I say, and to, let's say, mix with other people who are aware. So there's an organic spread of this awareness that is the way forward. So this is, if you can see, this is my whiteboard. I've returned to the whiteboard. And briefly, these are the steps which we can call the toxic steps that will lead to much of our illness. And does science back this up? Absolutely, if you look in the right places. We now know that adverse childhood experiences, abandonment, abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, even as a kid, for instance, at 6 I had my tonsils out and woke up vomiting blood. I can remember that, and that the fear from that may have been more damaging than my tonsils, the problem my tonsils were causing in the first place. And then added to that, of course, as I've already mentioned, most of us are born into a world where our parents and grandparents had all this within them, and through duty or repression or embarrassment or many other reasons didn't express it, so it was held within, so it was passed on to the future generations. So many of us, if these are steps towards illness and our body decompensating and us showing symptoms and our immune system collapsing, if you like, many of us will start much higher up, and therefore it doesn't take too many toxic loads, if you like, to decompensate and become ill. So we know that in childhood, and the earlier this happens, even before we can rationalize, therefore before the ages of 5, 6 or 7, if we're subjected to trauma, that can prime the genes. And because our bodies are more efficient in those days, in those past days, it doesn't necessarily manifest as illness, although of course it may well into headaches, abdominal pain and various other issues that a child would experience. However, what it does is prime the genes. So as we get older through our lives, and if we are to accumulate this toxic load, and then at the end of it have, towards the top of this, have an incident, whether it is an accident or surgery, or maybe we've lost our job, maybe there's a battle, but we've lost our job and we feel abandoned, or maybe we've been in a relationship that's actually contributed to all these steps, and we get separation. So remember, abandonment and separation probably lies at the roots of this. So something like that happens, our body is not able to cope with it as we're a little bit older. Our body becomes more entropic, in other words, complex. Our lives have become complex, and therefore a deterioration occurs, and when we become sick. And I see this with many, pretty well all people who presented with autoimmune conditions, whether it's bowel conditions like ulcerative colitis, Crohn's, going up to rheumatoid arthritis and cancers, whatever. And of course the emotional depression, the anxiety disorders, whatever. But it's those physical illnesses in which the genes have been primed. It's also important to know that there are genes which help our body coordinate itself. And if we are more and more abandoned, the evidence is again coming through that these genes lose their power, they're switched off. So the coordinating genes, the genes that like to be in a small community, that like to be loved, like to be in a state of timelessness, which occurs with creativity, can be switched off. And when we get our condition, our illness. My job then, of course, is not to make matters worse, not to isolate the person, not to divide and rule, because the label of illness, of course, can be isolating in itself. I want to know who is going to be supporting that person in a skillful, loving, compassionate way. And I would feel honoured in many cases to be invited into that clan, that whānau, and help coordinate that, because after all, that person is holding so much for the community. If they are in fact so abandoned and lonely, then we have to bring in the right people, and it does have to be the right people that don't alienate with them. So you can see how this step not only leads to illness, but also those conditions are very serious and can end lives. So these steps are in fact can be homicidal. And of course, during the more severe episodes in people's lives, they can be switched to a point where their lives feel meaningless and they can end their lives as well. So this is a very serious situation. And I have to say how disappointed I am that our health system is blind to this. And I think there are reasons to that, because I think, as I said before, we're all subject to this. And until we become aware of it in ourselves, it becomes very difficult to help other people. So here we see the separate steps, and it can be all the steps which somehow alienate the person and deep down from their environment, not just other humans and loved ones, but from the natural environment, their natural connections to the environment. As I've pointed out in a couple of books, that goes to our natural connection to more universal consciousness as well. So we talk about abandonment, separation. Evidence is strong that if there are strong, forceful, antagonistic arguments during pregnancy, the baby responds, recoils. If this continues in infancy, again, the baby will absorb this fear. Then we've got these other factors that are in society that are actually creating an atmosphere of fear, of divide and rule, divide and control, all alienating the person. This crazy continuation of this left-right paradigm, which I've experienced all my life, that doesn't seem to be particularly real, because, as I've talked about before and we've identified, 95% of people are struggling to live a life, whether they're in a family or a relationship, whatever, with certain morals and ethics, but knowing that being kind and respectful should get you a long way. So we're in this environment where we're bombarded by tension and fear. Sadly, in New Zealand we have the most pathetic mainstream media, I have to say that. And of course it looks quite glossy because the production values are good, because New Zealand actually probably leads the world in many ways through their digital and wonderful production values. And that's really good for New Zealand. However, what you get at 6 o'clock, the first item on the news, will be something that's supposed to shock you. And the word shock and horror is pretty well universally used in the first sentence. And what happens at 6 o'clock, of course, is that people are generally tired, they're sitting down, they're beginning to relax, they're beginning to get into a more hypnotic stage. And so in that hypnotic stage, fear is induced into them. And you'd have to say that many of our programs, although the production values are good and the acting is good, fear and battle and gore and desensitizing us to all this is to the forefront. So this is just one example of how we're being induced into a state of constant anxiety. Even the reporting of terrible accidents really has nothing to do with us apart from making us feel anxious and to induce a sense of grief in the more sensitive people that will struggle to be resolved because 2 minutes later something else comes along. And then we're in that fearful state where, of course, the advertisers can sell their deceptions to us because we're already in that state where we are going to be receiving those messages, how we can be rescued by material goods. So this is the atmosphere of gaslighting, which I've talked about, which, of course, the gaslighting leads to this complex post-traumatic stress. So they call it complex, known as this, post-traumatic stress disorder. And hopefully all of you who can see it can relate this to their lives. So I don't want this to be a label that separates people who aren't coping from the rest of us. We're all in it together. We're all in it together, and therefore we all can come out of it together as we welcome humanity. And yes, there are big issues for us in the medical profession. Us adding to the toxic load, both chemically and through our intent and separation of people with illness, classification of people that somehow separates them into victimhood. So many people that I'm seeing now are being tipped not only by awful abandonment and bullying that happens at work, and that's huge, but also by injuries, supposedly innocuous head injuries, for instance, banging the head, which is sort of, because they're up here, tip them into this other state. Surgery done for with the best intentions, with the best skill, tipping people into this state, even though the surgery is probably successful. The drugs we use, of course, are suppressant drugs, and they're there to suppress this, so therefore that suppresses our free expression. We now know the gut and the brain are so connected, and that antibiotics, in fact, which are suppressing us, we are bacteria to a great extent, both on the skin and in our bowels. These are being suppressed, quietened. Anything that quietens us down away from awareness is toxic to this area as well. And so I put whatever there. So I've got fear, divide, and rule, religious dogma, absolutely, wham, mind control, brain control. And then we've got, of course, those who start higher up because of, what's happened in our past, and we all start fairly high on this. The information age, the complexity of our age now, the speeding up of our age. Also, there are those with all this who are empathetic and sensitive, and because we're energetic beings, are affected by electromagnetic radiation. And now we see this explosion of electromagnetic radiation that we're going to be bombarded with, apparently for the good of humanity. And of course, watch how, when they promote this, they'll say, this is because so we can sit in driverless cars and to great safety. So the safety elements of say 5G technology and artificial intelligence and converting us into hybrids will be pushed, that this will be saving our lives, even with the idea of leading to our immortality. I gather Ray Kurzweil has said that in 30-40 years' time we will be digging our own graves. In other words, us who are hybrids between man and machine, and hence so we'll live for a long time, if not forever. We'll be digging the graves for our useless, hopeless, inadequate bodies, because that's what's being sold. That gaslighting is that we are useless, inadequate machines. That's all we are. We're just bags of chemicals. There is no soul, apparently. So here we go. There we go. Complex post-traumatic stress disorder, if you like, that is with all of us. How are we going to counteract? How are we going to change this? Through our awareness. Are we going to be activists? Well, just by being aware of being an activist. We become totally aware. So they talk about taking the red pill, I think that's what it is, to this gaslighting that we are being and have been subjected to. Initially we may feel embarrassed about this, but that's where the rest of us support. That's why I'm saying we've all been conned. And then we're going to get together and we're going to welcome back humanity, which is the way we're going to achieve proper health. So that's the place I'm going to now with my future videos, and I do hope you will join us and subscribe and press the bell or whatever you need to do and tell your friends, because the more of us that get this, the more likelihood is that this model will become redundant and less of this will happen, and we can be part of the change that we want, which of course we are. See you later. Thanks for listening. Bye.